From Korea to the digital age, the jet fighters that defined the Cold War. Over Sinuiju, North Korea, November 1950. American pilots climbing to intercept what their briefings told them were propeller-driven Soviet aircraft, slow, manageable, the kind of threat they'd trained for. What came out of the cloud cover was something else entirely, swept wings jet engine, a climb rate that left the F-80 shooting stars flat-footed at altitude. The MiG-15 hadn't just arrived, it had rewritten the entire geometry of the war in a single pass. And the United States Air Force, which had finished the Second World War as the most powerful air arm on the planet, spent the next 6 months in something it had never really experienced before: genuine strategic surprise. That moment, November 1950, over the Yalu River, is where this story actually starts. Not with the F-35, not with stealth, not with the polished narrative of inevitable Western technological superiority. It starts with the specific documented humiliation of watching a Soviet aircraft outperform everything you have, in the first real jet versus jet combat in history, over a peninsula most of your pilots couldn't have pointed to on a map 6 months earlier. Here's what 40 years of Cold War aviation actually was, not a story of America pulling steadily ahead, while the Soviets scrambled to keep up. It was a conversation, sometimes a shouting match. Two philosophies of violence, one that prioritized pilot and maneuverability, one that prioritized speed and systems, building answers to each other across 4 decades, across Korea and Vietnam and the Middle East, and proving each other catastrophically wrong on a remarkably regular basis. The aircraft are extraordinary. The part nobody talks about is how often the doctrine that produced them turned out to be completely mistaken. Let's go through it. Generation by generation. Starting with the moment swept wings changed everything. F-86 versus MiG-15. The MiG-15 had a higher service ceiling than the F-86 Sabre. It climbed faster, it carried heavier armament, 2 23mm cannons and a single 37mm that could theoretically destroy a B-29 bomber with one burst. On paper, it should have dominated. The kill ratio over Korea ended up somewhere between 7-1 and 11-1 in favor of the Sabre, depending on which mission records you're reading. Right. An aircraft that was technically inferior in several measurable categories won the air war by a factor of 10. And here's the part that actually reframes everything. When American analysts got access to a flyable MiG-15 after the war, a defecting North Korean pilot named No Kum-sok landed one at Kimpo in 1953. And yes, America paid him $100,000 for it. They found that the aircraft was genuinely excellent. It wasn't the machine, it was the pilots. Soviet and Chinese pilots flying the MiG-15 were, in this period, significantly less trained and less experienced in high-speed jet combat than their American counterparts. The F-86's hydraulic flight controls gave it an edge in the transonic envelope, around Mach 0.86 to 0.92, that allowed American pilots to maneuver where the MiG became difficult to control. But the margin wasn't the aircraft. The margin was a few hundred hours of experience. The lesson Korea was supposed to teach: pilot training is decisive. Aircraft capability matters, but the human inside the aircraft matters more. That lesson would be completely ignored for the next 15 years, with consequences that became impossible to overlook over North Vietnam. Also worth noting, the Hawker Hunter, Britain's answer to the swept wing generation, was by several accounts the most pleasant first-generation jet to actually fly. Not the fastest, not the highest climbing, but a machine so well-balanced that pilots who flew it for decades spoke about it the way people speak about a great car. Sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. Look, the 1950s did something to aerospace doctrine that it took Vietnam to undo. The belief, and it was more belief than analysis, was that Mach 2 solved everything. If you were fast enough, you couldn't be caught. If you had missiles, you didn't need a gun. The dogfight was over. Air combat was now a long-range exchange of guided weapons between aircraft that never needed to see each other. The F-104 Starfighter is the purest expression of this philosophy, and also its most spectacular cautionary tale. Clarence Kelly Johnson at Lockheed designed it in response to Korea, specifically in response to American pilots telling him they wanted something that climbed like a rocket and went like hell. What he built had a wing so thin and so short that it was essentially a missile with a pilot seat attached. The core depth at the root was roughly 3.4 inches. The leading edges were so sharp the ground crew had to cover them with protective strips to avoid injuries during servicing. The F-104 could hit Mach 2.2. It had a service ceiling of 58,000 feet. And when Germany adopted it as its primary multi-role fighter in the 1960s, it killed 116 of their pilots in peacetime accidents. 116. The Germans called it the Widowmaker and worse things. The wing that gave it its extraordinary performance characteristics also meant that engine failure at low altitude was frequently fatal. The aircraft had almost no glide ratio. It flew or it fell. Meanwhile, the MiG-21, which the Soviets were developing in the same era, went entirely the other direction. Smaller, simpler, a delta wing design optimized for speed and rate of climb, but fundamentally a point defense interceptor. Fast to altitude, fast to engagement, land quickly before the fuel ran out. Not complex, not multi-role. Produced in enormous numbers and exported to almost every client state the Soviet Union had. The MiG-21 is the AK-47 of jet fighters. Not the most sophisticated machine, not the most comfortable to fly, but built in over 11,000 units, still operational in over 20 countries today, and lethally effective in the right hands against opponents who underestimate it. Which they repeatedly did. And then there was the MiG-25 Foxbat. Seriously, nothing in this era is stranger than the Foxbat. Designed to intercept the B-70 Valkyrie, an American bomber that was canceled before the MiG-E-25 entered service, which meant the Soviets had built the fastest interceptor in history to kill an aircraft that didn't exist. The Foxbat could hit Mach 3.2. That's New York to London in under 90 minutes, but only briefly, and only while cooking its own engines. When Viktor Belenko defected to Japan in 1976 and handed the West a complete MiG-25 to study, the revelation wasn't that it was terrifying. The revelation was that it was built from vacuum tubes, steel, not titanium. Vacuum tubes, not transistors. Not because the Soviets were behind, because vacuum tubes are more resistant to the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear weapon. The aircraft was built for a specific war. It was extraordinary within that logic and almost nothing outside of it. If your brain hasn't completely given up after vacuum tubes doing Mach 3.2, subscribe, because we haven't even got to Vietnam yet, which is where the entire second-generation doctrine goes up in flames over Hanoi. Stay with me. Here is the institutional humiliation that reshaped American air power for 30 years. The F-4 Phantom, McDonnell Douglas's monster, Mach 2.2, beyond visual range radar missiles, designed explicitly on the doctrine that the gun was obsolete, went to Vietnam against a North Vietnamese Air Force flying MiG-17s. The MiG-17 was a first-generation design, essentially a refined MiG-15. It was subsonic, it dated from 1952, it should not have been competitive. In 1966 and 1967, the kill ratio over North Vietnam for American aircraft was approximately 2.3 to 1, against an aircraft designed a decade and a half earlier. For context, Korea had been 10 to 1. The gap between what the doctrine promised and what the combat record showed was not marginal, it was structural. Here's the thing. The MiG-17 turned. It turned very well at low speed in close quarters, and the F-4 without a gun, the aircraft, the Air Force, had literally not fitted with a cannon because missiles made guns unnecessary. Could not kill it. The AM-7 Sparrow missile required the pilot to maintain radar lock throughout the engagement, meaning the aircraft had to fly straight while a maneuvering enemy aircraft tried to kill it. The AIM-9 Sidewinder required a rear aspect heat signature. Neither weapon was designed for the close, turning knife fight that the MiG-17 kept forcing on American pilots who had trained almost exclusively for beyond visual range engagements. The F-4 eventually got a gun pod, bolted on externally, producing a noticeable drag penalty. But there. The lesson should have been obvious 2 years earlier. The F-8 Crusader, which did have a gun and whose pilots had trained accordingly, achieved the best kill ratio of any American fighter in Vietnam, roughly 6 to 1. An aircraft the Navy considered obsolete, doing what the Navy's primary fighter couldn't. The response was Top Gun. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, established in 1969, was specifically built to retrain naval aviators in close quarters combat because the doctrine had trained it out of them. The graduation exercise was a simulated dogfight. The thesis of the entire program was that Korea's lesson, the pilot decides the outcome, had been buried under 15 years of missile theology, and Vietnam had just excavated it at enormous cost. What Vietnam produced ultimately was the F-15 Eagle. And if there is one number in this entire 40-year story that is philosophically difficult to accept, it's this one. The F-15 Eagle has over 100 confirmed air-to-air kills in combat. 0 air combat losses, not one. In 40 years of operational service across multiple conflicts against multiple adversaries, no enemy aircraft has ever shot down an F-15 in air-to-air combat. Right, 0 losses. The Eagle was designed from scratch with every lesson of Korea and Vietnam embedded in the specifications. Maneuverability at all speeds, not just at altitude and at Mach 2, but down in the weeds where the fighting actually happened. A massive radar, long-range missiles and a gun, a thrust-to-weight ratio that exceeded 1 at combat weight, meaning the aircraft could accelerate while going straight up. The cockpit was designed around the pilot's ability to see. The large bubble canopy gave visibility that earlier fighters simply didn't have. And the F-16 Fighting Falcon, developed in parallel as a lightweight complement, took this further. A relaxed, static instability design that a computer had to constantly correct, making it the most agile fighter of its era. The Soviets' response was the MiG-25 Fulcrum and the Su-27 Flanker. And here's where I have to be direct. These were not inferior copies of American philosophy. They were different answers to the same problem, and in some respects, they were better answers. The Su-27 Flanker, first flown in 1977, entering Soviet service in 1985, had a super maneuverable design that Western analysts initially dismissed, and then, after German reunification handed NATO a squadron of former East German MiG-29s to study, very much stopped dismissing. The Flanker's Pugachev's Cobra maneuver, pitching the nose to 90 degrees or beyond at high speed, momentarily halting the aircraft's forward progress without losing altitude, was not a party trick. It was a demonstration of energy management that Western aircraft could not replicate. At close range, it allowed the pilot to break an enemy's gun solution in a way that conventional maneuverability didn't. If the MiG-21 was the AK-47, the Su-27 was something else entirely. A masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering that the Cold War ended before it ever had to prove itself against the machines it was built to fight. Before we land this thing, tell me in the comments, which of these fighters surprised you the most? And which one, if you're being completely honest with yourself, you'd have actually wanted to fly? Here's what this 40-year arc actually looks like when you compress it. Korea proved that the pilot decides the outcome and the institutions immediately forgot it. The missile age arrived and the gun was declared obsolete, and Vietnam proved that catastrophically wrong within 15 years. The speed obsession produced aircraft that killed their own pilots in Germany and an interceptor built from vacuum tubes that outran everything chasing it. Vietnam produced Top Gun, Top Gun produced the F-15, and the F-15 achieved a combat record that makes it sound like a mathematical error. The Soviets built their masterpiece and the Americans built theirs, and the war they were both built for never came. And here's the thing that sits with me longest about this whole story. The F-15 Eagle, the Su-27 Flanker, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the MiG-29 Fulcrum. These aircraft were designed in complete earnest to fight each other. The pilots who trained in them trained to kill the pilots in the other one. They never did. The Cold War ended in 1991, and the two most capable generations of fighters humanity had ever built stood down without meeting in the engagement they were designed for. What those 40 years actually were, in retrospect, was an argument in metal and thrust. Two philosophies spending 4 decades answering each other, proving each other wrong, rebuilding, and answering again. The dialogue never got to its conclusion. The aircraft are still here. The war they were built for never came. That is, depending on how you look at it, either the greatest waste in the history of military engineering or the best possible outcome. I find myself thinking it's both.